It's House of Strauss. We are joined by football expert, NFL expert. Actually, you do some college too. Warren Sharp. I don't want to short sell you. I don't want to short sell a man who has a book out that's over 500 pages that's highly informative about every single NFL team. How you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great. Football season's around the corner, so I mean that's always a great time for me. Love it when the games actually matter and start meaning something. So it's been a long journey. I feel like I put in the work in the off season studying these teams, writing about them, as you indicated, kind of the 550 plus page book that I've got out previewing the season, and now I'm ready for to really see if my thoughts about what I believe is going to happen actually come to fruition or where I'm wrong. And it's a fun journey at the beginning of the season.
I mean, can you just enjoy it a bit like a fan? I got that question off the rip. For those of you who do not know, Warren is just the king of the deep dive, incredibly informative. You might have heard him on Bill Simmons. You might have heard him on Rich Eisen. And when I hear you, it's a level of work and dedication that I think for most people would cause burnout. But are you just, I mean, can you enjoy it the way that Joe Fan might be able to enjoy it?
Not really. I don't want to just totally equate it to like, what is it, taking the red pill in the Matrix, and then all of a sudden, like you can't, there's no going back from this point in time. But there's no true pure fandom from me anymore at all. I root for efficiency wherever I see it. I identify inefficiency. I try to call that out. I like things, because I'm also betting on these games, I like things to be as predictable as possible without as many outside factors influencing things that I'm not aware of, so that it makes the job a little bit easier to try to forecast outcomes of games, because then I can between the lines, I understand everything that's going into these games. And so for those reasons, like schedule inequalities or referees doing something differently that we didn't know this was going to happen. All of a sudden, they're calling things differently. I have to study all of these factors that most other people aren't even aware of. Like a lot of people don't even think that there's inefficiency in the schedule. They just think, oh, well, the league's going to give a fair, like the league's just going to roll out a schedule just like they do in basketball and baseball. But the difference is there's so many fewer games in the NFL. So these types of inequalities matter a lot more when they are occurring in the NFL. So there is no going back. There's no true enjoyment. I'm always trying to, even if I'm just watching a game and I have no action on it at all, and I don't really care about the outcome from a rooting interest, I'm trying to identify certain things that I'm seeing. I'm studying the game so that it will help me for not only for the future, but also to make observations, because I'm also a content creator. So I'm trying to come up with things that are unique or interesting that I can observe from this game that most people aren't paying as close attention to. And then I can highlight those and bring a little bit more awareness to them. And then that just helps create, better content and more people interested in reading the content.
Well, that hunt for efficiency is going to anchor our talk, because this is something that I've become fascinated by with football. I believe, and maybe you disagree with me, that the NFL is almost in this late 1990s, early 2000s space, which is so bizarre because it's our most obsessed over sport. It's America's favorite sport. And yet it seems like it's not altogether systemically analyzed or analyzed in the way that baseball came to be. Now, I think many people would say that there are so many moving parts that it's impossible, therefore. But you often come up with these nuggets that make me go, do the people running football actually really understand it all that well? How much low-hanging fruit is out there? How much could an outsider suggest that would change things? You had an example where you had a stat on passing plays that started behind the line of scrimmage just not working out too well. And yet I will often see such plays. Could you go over that? And maybe that could be a little beachhead into this broader conversation.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things as it just relates to that topic of where are quarterbacks targeting passes on the field? Are they throwing the ball behind the line of scrimmage or beyond the line of scrimmage? We have seen the way the defense has been played evolve over the years. Offense, I don't study other sports, so I can't speak to those. But as it relates to the NFL specifically and football in general, the rules have been changed over the years to help offenses a lot more than defenses. They've been given the upper hand. It's a lot easier to pass the football now. They've protected the quarterbacks a lot more. They protect the wide receivers and defenseless wide receivers a lot more. And it didn't initially, like, people didn't start throwing the ball like right away at higher rates, but it's evolved to doing that when they realized, hey, these plays offer a lot more upside than run plays. And now we've got rules that are protecting us so we can execute some of these plays more frequently. But then defenses are starting to fight back over the last several years and try to prevent the big plays down the field from those pass plays, prevent those big gains. And they've been playing more of too high shell coverage, just like different cover 2, cover 4 looks where they're dropping safeties back. They're trying to get quarterbacks to throw the ball short and underneath versus over the top of the defense to prevent those quick scores or quick, 20, 30 plus yard gains on single plays, and instead make quarterbacks matriculate the ball down the field a little bit more frequently. They're also playing with a little bit lighter boxes and daring offensive coordinators to call run plays because they know that offensive coordinators now have learned that passing is more efficient. And so they want to pass the ball more, but now they're playing with lighter boxes to say, we'll let you pass, but you're still maybe only going to gain 5 or 6 yards on these pass plays. Will you dare try to run it on us? The Baltimore Ravens were notorious of doing that just last season with their light box counts in and throughout the playoffs. And I was just like, why aren't teams running the football a little bit more frequently, especially early in the game when you're not behind? And it's something that's rare for me to advocate for because I'm such a proponent of the most efficient plays are passes. But when a defense is playing like that, you have to try to attack them on the ground. They were the NFL's worst run defense because they played with light boxes, yet teams kept throwing the football on them, even at the beginning of the game when the score is 0-0. But as it relates to this specific topic, as teams are dropping back more and taking away the deeper passes, offensive coordinators are throwing the ball underneath a little bit more frequently. And the style of defense, I know eventually we're going to talk about like tight ends versus wide receivers and that argument. But one of the things that quarterbacks have been doing a little bit more frequently now, because there aren't just wide open receivers being found in man coverage and that he could just beat the guy and get the ball out relatively quickly. They're having to read the zones and they're having to hold on to the football a little bit longer. And oftentimes that's leading to plays that are designed that are being thrown behind the line of scrimmage. Obviously the quarterback, for every pass he has to make, he's going to be standing behind the line of scrimmage. But we're talking about where on the field is he targeting? And we are seeing like 23% of passes over the last couple of years being thrown behind the line of scrimmage. That was down to like 18% like 6-7 years ago. And it doesn't sound like much, but it is a fairly high rate, which passes are being thrown now behind the line of scrimmage. And not only is that efficiency not any longer even, and those passes were always inefficient, it's gotten significantly worse. The efficiency of passes thrown behind the line of scrimmage has declined on an almost annual basis for, over a decade now. And we are seeing far too many teams still throw the ball short without efficiency. And the best statistic, just the easiest way to simplify this for everybody out there is that every single team in the NFL, there's 32 of them. Every single team, when they are throwing the ball behind the line of scrimmage, they have negative EPA per pass attempt, meaning expected points added. It's a statistic, and they are poor. They are below average when they're throwing the ball behind the line of scrimmage. All but 3 teams have positive EPA per attempt when they throw the ball beyond the line of scrimmage. So even like the 5th worst passing attack, even the 6th worst passing attack in the NFL has a better efficiency throwing the ball when they throw the ball beyond the line of scrimmage than the very best offense in the NFL does when they throw the ball short of the line of scrimmage. So, I am hopeful that more teams this season, like I wrote an article on it, published it on the website, trying to promote this. I do talk to some OCs and some head coaches that call plays. I'm trying to open their eyes to this factor that they need to be looking to try to attack these defenses, try to test them. These defenses, they want you to throw the ball short because it plays into what they're trying to do. So you have to figure out ways around that, and you can't just buy into what they're selling.
Yeah, there's some nuance. I'm sure there are some scenarios where throwing that pass would make sense. I would analogize it. You mentioned not following the other sports. It reminds me a little bit of basketball, where they changed the rules in the early 2000s and you couldn't have as much contact with offensive players. And there was a little bit of a lag between the changing of the game, because the game is just its rules, and the strategic response to it and understanding of what to do in accordance with it. And for a long time, teams continue to do too many post-ups. There are scenarios in the NBA where posting up makes sense. I'm not trying to be unnuanced with it, but it is just like the dumb guy take on it could be correct. The dumb guy could intuit that passing behind the line of scrimmage doesn't work out as often because you're farther from where you want to be. Similarly, having your back to your goal, that is the basket, might be suboptimal versus other methods and attempts of trying to score. And it appears as though there are just tried and true methods, I guess, quotation marks, that coaches are just addicted to, and they know way more about football on the granular level than observers. But I just wonder how much of it is held up to scrutiny and how much of it is tradition. I mean, do you think that they still punt too often, for instance, because that's been a talking point forever? And how much is something like that just about this is the way we've always done it versus this is logically, mathematically how we should be approaching it?
The funny part is, again, only speaking about NFL coaches, but to me, so much of that profession is animal instinct. It's like the animal kingdom out there, where the number one priority for these coaches is simply self-preservation. How do I keep my job? And the more that you stray away from the norm or tradition, as you indicate, the more likely you're going to be scrutinized after the game. What if you tried something and it didn't work and you lost that game? And then, owners can say that like all they're doing is just evaluating the coach, but owners read the papers, owners hear the fans. And so if the papers and the reporters are saying things that then the fans pick up on and they're echoing them and there's an uproar on that part, it's hard to keep a coach feeling good about his job security. And as a result, a lot of these guys, it's hard getting a NFL head coaching job. There's only 32 of them. And then even when you get one of those jobs, there's no certainty that it's going to be a good job. Like you might have your pick of a couple jobs. A lot of these guys don't. They get lucky. The owners go out there or the GMs, they interview a bunch of people, and you don't have your choice of like 2, 3, 4 jobs. You've got one opportunity, one place wants to bring you in, and they're the ones that are deciding to hire you. You either take it or leave it. But in other situations, like even when you do have a choice, you don't know what that landscape is going to look like after a year or two. I mean, perfect example is like, look at Brian Daboll. He won Offensive Coach of the Year with the Buffalo Bills. He helped turn around Josh Allen's career. 2020, 2021, this team's winning all these games, scoring all these points, setting records. He gets the New York Giants head coaching opportunity, and he's strapped to Daniel Jones, who like we've seen his struggles, and now like Brian Daboll does not look good at all, even though he looked brilliant in Buffalo. So it's hard to have these jobs. I do agree with you. Teams need to be more aggressive. Teams need to punt the football less. One of the biggest things for me when I'm kind of game planning for games or talking to coaches is just emphasizing the importance of that opening script, how aggressive you plan to be in that first quarter of a game, because that drives so many things that end up happening. The NFL is there's so many less point scores than there are in basketball, right? You've got a touchdown, you got a field goal, and they don't happen all that much in games. And for you to go down the field on your opening drive and get 7 points and have a lead, and then maybe it's very easy to be tied or leading at halftime as a result. And what's your opponent doing in the second half? Becoming more desperate, playing very minus EV, making decisions they wouldn't ordinarily make that would be more difficult for your defense to stop and very unpredictable. Instead, they're becoming very predictable offensively because they are trailing, and it's easier for your defense, which is, like we said, they're already handcuffed based upon the rules construct. Now that defense it's easier for them. So like, that's why getting these leads is so important. And so I firmly believe that more teams out there need to get away from the old school thinking of, I don't want to lose the game early, number one. Number two, I got to be careful with my young quarterback. We don't want to ask him to do too much early in the game. These types of things put your team behind the sticks, make it more difficult for your quarterback. When you're very cautious on early downs with a young quarterback, what's going to end up happening? Most of his pass attempts are going to come on obvious passing situations on third down where the defense is playing the pass. Whereas if you're trying to get out early and you're letting him throw the ball on first down when the defense might be playing the run, you have more opportunities to potentially score points, have dropbacks which aren't feeling pressure and being blitzed. And then you're in the second half with a lead or tied, and you're not scrambling from behind in obvious passing situations. So it all feeds off of one another. And I do think more teams need to figure out how, the Green Bay Packers, perfect example, how they flipped the switch middle of last season, got so much more aggressive early on in games. And if you recall, they even got so aggressive to the point, and I had written about this because I was very frustrated about the Green Bay Packers in the start of their season. So midway through, I started calling out all these things that they should be improving upon. And a couple weeks later, they started doing most of them. But one thing I did not mention that they took it to the next level was they started when they won the toss, taking the ball. Everybody pretty much defers. They're like time after time they won the toss. They were taking the ball. They were trying to go down and score points early to put themselves in a position of strength throughout the rest of that first half. So it was a lot of fun seeing them do that, but I wish more teams were as aggressive as they became.
Yeah, they nearly beat the Niners doing that, and the Niners' tendency is to defer, to try to lap the other team, to try to time up that first half score with getting the ball back. And that makes some sense, but if it's a playoff game and all of a sudden you're down 7-0, you can start to find yourself in a position where you're reeling. But it's interesting to me how we expect the people who know the most in these sports to be completely correct. But I've seen this play out in basketball, the sport I covered, where for a long time there was resistance to just shooting more three-pointers. And it's funny, the language is similar. Similar language was used on shooting a lot of three-pointers as for passing so often. It was equated with softness in a way. It was, don't fall in love with the three. And then you hear in football, don't get pass happy. And there's almost this sense that doing the thing that's not as fun, that's lower efficiency and lower yield, somehow is just the cost you need to pay and the drudgery that's necessary to win in the end. I'm not, again, trying to deny the game theoretical aspect of running the ball. There are situations you should do it, but it's just funny to me how much of the decision making is dictated by vibes, is dictated by the language that's used, again, as opposed to data. Has that part changed? It seems like passing, that revolution has occurred in football, or do you still think that teams run too often? What's your take?
In general, I still think we've got more to go in terms of how much more we can be passing the football. But the good news is we've got some of the smartest teams and smartest coaches out there with some good quarterbacks that are passing the football a lot. You've got Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes, and they're kind of leading the way for us. And so it's become a lot more acceptable to do it. It doesn't always work. One of Andy Reid's disciples, Eric Bieniemy, went to Washington, and they had the most pass-heavy offense in the NFL last year. But the way that he conducted that first down passing attack with that team was so inefficient that it did not actually help the team have success. They were lining up in 3 wide receiver sets, no motion, no misdirection, no disguise, no pre-snap, no play action. Just stand there in shotgun almost every single snap and just have a young, inexperienced quarterback beat the defense with suboptimal wide receivers for the most part. And that's not going to have a lot of success. And it didn't in Washington. He was one and done as an OC there. There are absolutely, the data has shown, there's different times that are more efficient to run the football. And I think, it's obvious this one, but when the defense is presenting a lighter box, I'm massively in favor of audibling at the line of scrimmage to get yourself into the right play. And this is where, we don't have to go into the whole pass protection discussion right now, but I believe quarterbacks nowadays own a lot more of not just amount that they're sacked, but the amount that they're pressured based upon what they do pre-snap in terms of changing the play call, changing the protection, or immediately post-snap, their awareness of what the defense might be bringing so that they can either get the ball out or move and respond. And we know now that, it used to be that if you've got a good offensive line, like a bad quarterback, oh, he's fine. His protection, he's not going to get pressured that much. His line is really good. And similarly, like Patrick Mahomes, well, how's their offensive line? If their offensive line isn't really good, then he's going to be have a problematic season this year. And we've seen Patrick Mahomes get to the Super Bowl. Obviously, he lost to Tom Brady when he lost 3 offensive linemen in that game. There are
limits. Yeah.
There are limits, but for the most part, I mean, he can still have a ton of success because he can control that pressure more than we used to think. And not just the pressure, but like how quickly he gets out of it and how he's avoiding sacks. Whereas like a guy like Daniel Jones cannot. In addition to running the ball when there's light boxes, like running the ball down inside of the red zone, when you spread out the defense in 3 wide receiver sets. This is how Brian Daboll, his rookie season with the New York Giants, despite having Daniel Jones, won Coach of the Year, went to the playoffs and won a playoff game. It wasn't because Daniel Jones had a good year. Now, the end result of them having team success landed Daniel Jones a new contract, which I was strongly against and wrote a lot about it before they gave him that contract. But the way that they would call run plays down there in the red zone and take the ball out of Daniel Jones's hands to have it success against the defense and end up scoring as many points as they needed to. They weren't winning games by a lot. They were coming back and it wasn't sustainable. But there are absolutely times that are more efficient to run the football. So I'm not going to advocate that you should never run the football, but I still think that we have room to grow in terms of how frequently we're passing the football. And especially when you're talking about some of the younger quarterbacks that are getting thrust into starting lineups more frequently, potentially, especially this season. Letting these guys pass the ball a little bit more on early downs is absolutely going to be advantageous to their growth. You have to do it the right way, but it's going to prevent them from falling behind in games and getting pressured as frequently as they otherwise might.
Yeah, I'm probably a little more anti-punting than I am anti-running. Punting, in a way, is just a very organized interception that you throw with your foot, and it isn't necessarily thought of that way, but it is, in a way, a turnover. I think the biases that creep in, we can make this analogy to baseball. Some of it is just dictated by the stats that we think of as the big stats we pay attention to. In baseball, famously, batting average and RBIs were numbers that told you something. It gave you kind of a general idea of a guy's capacity, but they weren't ideal for a lot of reasons, and they didn't convey the true value. And on base percentage and then other stats they came up with were more telling. And when you look at a quarterback stats on Pro Football Reference, the top line, it's the victories, it's the completions, it's the yards per attempt, touchdowns, interceptions, no sacks. And so, as you said, sacks mostly a quarterback stat, even if we've blamed the O-line for it for a while. And it was so... I thought it was the best part to me. My favorite part of that documentary on the Patriots that was very flawed, that was done by Kraft, was the internal conversations they had in the building about why Drew Bledsoe was cooked. And a lot of the fans were clamoring for him to still be the quarterback, but Belichick and Adams, being smart football guys who could maybe get at the right answer without being stat heads about it, although Adams might have been, was that he was just taking too many sacks. And so often a quarterback is overrated because that's just not a top line statistic that people rattle off as part of the problem, even though, as you've said, it's a drive killer. So that's a very leading question. But do you think somehow these inefficiencies creep in just because of the numbers we're used to looking at versus the numbers that tell the true tale?
Yeah, I mean, there have been some coaches that I've spoken with, and some of the things that they like to share with me are the most rudimentary stats that they can look up about, well, when we do this, or this is our record, or, there's some coaches that, I won't name them by name, but they've said this publicly, like the rule of 53 or 55 or something like that, where, it's something about like the number of of play calls that we have, or something about the run game, and we're more likely to win. And it's just like these correlations that don't make any sense, because that's not how they're getting the lead. They're running late in games. Yeah. But absolutely, there's a lot of, we're seeing the shift. I mean, I will say this, like with the tracking data and the data that's been made available to teams over the last, I'd say, like 7-8 years, we are seeing shifts in what most teams are willing to spend on their analytics departments and building those up, as well as kind of how much they're staffing those departments, and potentially the influence that those teams have over the final decision. But at the end of the day, you have to have a really solid marriage between the head coach, and if he's calling plays, or the play caller, and that analytics department, as to what their contributions are going to be, and then some sort of response from the staff and inclusion where possible. And it's got to come from a philosophical standpoint. And then it can also occur from a game planning, play by play, early offense in games, that type of situation. But there is, I think coaches are getting younger around the NFL, and coaches are getting a little bit smarter, and more, these younger guys are a little bit more open to the data and the analysis. And the other thing that's occurred as well is it's not just behind the scenes, like in the buildings that are very private, very secure. They don't share it much. It's people publicly getting access to the data and information that are writing studies up, some of which I do, some of which other people do, that then some of these coaches can just look at, or they get forwarded by their friend, their childhood friend. Hey, have you checked this out? And then they look at it and like, wow, this is pretty interesting. And then they show it to their analytics guys. And then there's a discussion that occurs. So there's more ideas that can now come from even outside the buildings, whereas previously, before we in the public realm had access to a lot of play-by-play data, we weren't contributing nearly as many cutting edge or next level types of analyses that could benefit teams. So I think it's the whole universe of it that's helping move the NFL in the right direction, both externally and internally within those buildings.
Why is defense winning over the past decade? And that runs contrary to what a lot of people think, because people still remember when the rule changes happened. Peyton Manning had issues. The NFL changed things, opened it up. And you hear fans talk, it seems as though they think that it's still the high scoring days. But as you've written about, scoring has dropped. Why, when everybody has access to information, is it the defense that's getting the better of the offense, even though I think the league would want more scoring to happen?
Well, that second part is a loaded question. We could talk about that. But I think that there is a lot of, it really started to me, I guess, with Patrick Mahomes and Tyreek Hill, back in, 2018, 2019. We were at a time when passing was everybody was passing the football. Defenses played a lot of man coverage, and, they were putting up so many points. And obviously we had years where offenses scored at different points in time. Remember, like the 2007 Patriots that went undefeated until the Super Bowl with Randy Moss and Tom Brady, a lot of deep field, quick scores. But the defenses have made their adjustments, and it became difficult. That first year after the defenses made their adjustments, I want to say it might have been like 2019, 2020, somewhere in that neighborhood. We saw some of these offenses take step backs, and it took a little while for them to then make some adjustments and get a little bit back on track, but they never got fully back on track. Now, the one year that's the anomaly is 2020, because there were no crowds in the stands due to COVID. And that one season, we saw road offensive scoring explode compared to norms. And as a result of road offensive scoring, we saw more games going over the total. We saw more, offensive statistics being put up. Just in general, it was easier for those offenses to operate and make audibles at the line of scrimmage, because there's no crowd there, so they can communicate. They can snap the ball as close to, that play clock getting down to zero as they want without fear. Whereas normally, a crowd is going to start getting louder and louder the closer you get down to zero and try to snap the ball. You're going to have more false start penalties. You're going to have more offensive holding penalties due to lack of communication, things of that nature. Those things really went down. Scoring went up that 1 year of 2020. But now it's been in a little bit of decline. Now, I wrote a lot about why last season started off really poorly. I frankly don't know what's going on with NFL officiating of late. It used to be, and this is one of the things that I study a little bit more than probably the average person, just because I'm trying to figure out what's going on here. And I need to be aware of everything that is going on. But it used to be that, you could see they would come up with their desired rules changes in the offseason. They would get proposed. Those rules would either get passed or they would not. And then they would become implemented, and then you could see the impact. But we are seeing more, whether it's official emphasis, rules emphasis this year, or it's unofficial. They aren't announcing it, but they're just suddenly calling more of it, like we started last season with. All of a sudden, they're just going to call a bunch of ineligible man downfield penalties, like 3-4 times more than we had seen in the first 5-6 weeks of the season than we had seen in any of the years past. It's like, this was not an official emphasis. There was no press release on this. We did not know that this was going to be coming out, and it was impacting scoring. And so I got really detailed into that, as well as some of the other penalties that were either being called or not being called compared to average years. And eventually scoring got back on track a little bit, but you're right. It is still down, and it's because of the way the defenses are playing right now. Preventing those big plays with the cover 2 zone defenses that are keeping everything in front of them. And they're trying to make the offense eventually make a mistake. If you have a 4-play drive down the field because you gained 30 yards in one play and you're scoring the ball from the 15-yard line, let's pretend, there's only 4 times that you could potentially make an error on that drive. Whereas if you have a 10-play drive, all the defense has to do really is win one of those plays to really set the offense back. Like you talked about, a sack, drive killer. The rate of scoring dips by a massive amount when you record a sack. An offensive holding penalty. Offensive holding is actually more likely to be called on a run play than a pass play. But you get a coach calls a run play or sometimes a pass play, even because the defense gets to jump to the line of scrimmage, because guess what? They aren't calling defensive offsides nearly as much as they once did. And then all of a sudden that offensive lineman has to hold a little bit. And these defensive players, they're getting a lot more athletic than they were years ago. They're faster, they're quicker, they're able to get up to the quarterback, and the offense has to react with a shorter time to do so. You get one holding, that's almost as good as a sack because it's 10 yards, but you do get to repeat the down. These are penalties that end up hurting a lot as well. So defenses want these offenses to take their time marching the ball down the field, as many plays as possible before they end up trying to score so that you can sneak one good defensive play in there. And offenses haven't really found their counterpunch to that. And I don't know that I see it coming this season either, to be honest with you. I don't think that we're going to see a big boom in offensive scoring this year, but I hope that some of these guys have some more tricks up their sleeve, because I always love seeing what Kyle Shanahan comes out with or Mike McDaniel comes out with, these different things that they end up introducing the first couple of weeks of the season. I'm really eager to see what they bring out this season, because we certainly haven't seen it in the preseason. This has been one of the worst preseasons I can remember, just boring, mundane football.
Yeah, it hasn't been exciting. I wonder if the NFL found itself in this situation because they didn't want too many offensive or defensive pass interference calls, because that doesn't feel too good. It doesn't feel earned when there's a play 40 yards down the field and then a flag is thrown and there was no completion and maybe the wide receiver flopped and it's rewarded with this massive penalty. So just, it looks like not as many of those are happening, and that will benefit the defense. And I think that there's some uneasiness with that, with calling that one in particular. And speaking of this boring preseason and Kyle Shanahan, I was just looking at some clips of the fairly, let's just say rough Brock Purdy preseason, getting your feet wet. outing. And what I noticed was that wide receivers down the field, they're slipping and falling because they're just getting bumped and manhandled. And I'm not an expert enough on what the rules are. Maybe it was in accordance with the rules. I'm not saying that it was called incorrectly, but that to me, I just would highlight that as, hey, if they call that more stringently, fans will be frustrated because there will be these flags and these huge penalties, but that's probably the only realistic, easy way to suddenly boost scoring to back where it was.
Well, yeah, what they've done this preseason is crazy to me. Today, I wrote an article doing a deep dive because we saw the second week of preseason games, and we don't know what's going to happen yet. The coaches are starting to announce, are we playing our starters in week 3, which is the final week of preseason, or are we not? We know that there's only 3 weeks of preseason. There used to be 4, so teams were used to doing things a little bit differently in the past. But through the first 2 weeks of preseason this year compared to last year, the year before that, and I have access to data in preseason going back to 2017, we are seeing, I want to say it's like 15 points per game on average by these offenses, which is the lowest that we have seen. We are seeing massive inefficiency from these offenses. It starts with the quarterback position. Now, understandable. They're sitting some of their starting quarterbacks, but they've been doing that in years past also. Might be a slightly higher rate, but it's not substantially higher. We are seeing offensive coaches and play callers not care as much. I mean, like Kyle gave up play calling, I think, in his last preseason game. We were seeing that happening a fair amount around the league. Some of these head coaches just don't want to deal with the stress. They also want to reward their offensive coordinator, give him an opportunity to go out there and call some plays so that if he's in a job interview, he could say he's actually done it before. So we've seen that, and that's a factor as well. But a lot of it is these penalties. And to your point, like with Brock Purdy, I'll just outline some of the stats that I've pulled. 39% decline in defensive pass interference calls this year versus the average in the last 6 years. Wow. We have seen only 21 of those called through 2 weeks. Same number of games, 32 games. Only 21 of them this year. We've seen 35 per year in the past. In terms of defensive pass interference yardage, in the past, we saw 612 yards of total yards per year in these first 2 weeks of preseason. 612. This year, we're only at 337. So that's a massive decline as well in terms of DPI yardage that's being called. We're seeing a lot less defensive holding, 24% decline in defensive holding penalties. And then I already mentioned the offsides penalties. We've seen a decline in roughing the passer penalties. Both of those are around a 50% decline year over year. And total defensive penalties is down massively. Whereas penalties on the offensive side of the ball, we have not seen that decline. We have not seen a decline in total offensive penalties. I want to say we were at 228 in the past several years, the past 6 years. This year we were at 222. So 6 less out of 228 that we've been down. I want to say this like a couple percent. So we are not seeing a decrease on the offensive side, but a massive decrease on the defensive side. It has led to this lower scoring. To your point, one of the big issues that I had last year with the way that these games were being officiated is that the way that they were calling the penalties was helping the defenses. It was keeping these games closer keeping these games lower scoring. But what we weren't seeing was closer games. We actually saw more lopsided games. The way that they were calling these penalties really helps the better defense and really hurts the offense that's going up against them. And so we are seeing like your average to below average offenses not really being able to score very many points against decent defenses. And the scores would be like, the final score of the game, 23-6, 23-9. The games like this, which aren't all that exciting. They're not that compelling. They're lower scoring. So we saw record numbers of unders come in from a betting perspective, but a record number of favorites covering the spreads. Underdogs were not having the opportunities to win games outright or cover the spreads last season, the way that these games started. And we're sort of trending in that same direction this preseason. And I don't understand why. Like I'm in the process because I just did this analysis, literally wrote this article this morning. I got to start talking to some people around the league to try to understand, was there an edict that was handed out by the league to reduce these? Because you make a good point that potentially they don't want the fans to get really upset. What are a couple of the real easy reactions that fans have to penalties? It's roughing the passer and it's DPI that gives a team like 30, 40 yards. Like those are the two that are just like, oh my God, they show the replays really close. They zoom in 4K and sometimes they could be right or wrong. Maybe they're trying to reduce those types because those are some of the ones that they're dropping down on tremendously this preseason. But I think the way that I view penalties, I don't know how about you viewed them from your basketball days, but I want the rule book. If you don't like a rule any longer, get it out of the rule book. I want to understand what the rules are. I want my players to be coached on, hey, let's try to push it to the edge. Maybe we go past the edge, but we understand what the rules are and how they're going to enforce it. And I know each referee does it a little bit differently. This is why we track ref data. We understand what refs are more likely to call what types of penalties and where it could give different coaches advantages and try to talk to some of those guys in those certain situations. But I just want to know what's expected here so that we can watch the games and not overreact to things. The coaches can tell their players what to expect. And we, when we're like betting on these games, know what to expect as well.
Yeah, I think I want the rule to be called according to the letter with some human interpretation. It would drive me crazy in basketball when James Harden would obviously flop and the ref would shrug and go, well, according to the letter. I mean, if you're seeing somebody trying to initiate the contact, I think there is a little bit of calling something according to the spirit, but you often hear praise for swallowing the whistle. How often do you hear an announcer go, they're letting them play, and saying that that's a good thing? And I think fans would say that they want that in the discrete example, but maybe not in the aggregate when it leads to all this drop in scoring. And I think attached to that, there's been a lot of analysis of how these first round quarterbacks that get drafted aren't working out too often. CJ Stroud is a big exception. And you're seeing a rate of success when a team will make the biggest investment that it can, and that's drafting a first round quarterback, and it's succeeding maybe between 25 to 35% of the time. That's a crazy fail rate. And I think what people might not understand is that the game has changed. And so maybe this is happening because teams don't know what they're doing when they select a quarterback. Sure. But what's also happening is in the background, with nobody noticing, the game has been switched from all pro to all Madden, and the difficulty level has been ratcheted up. And so these quarterbacks, these rookie quarterbacks, are getting thrown into a situation that's maybe harder than quarterbacks were thrown into a decade ago.
Yeah, well, I absolutely agree with you. And it's part of like what's going on the youth levels and into high school, into college, where quarterbacks now are being asked to do something a little bit different. It's a lot more of the 7-on-7. It's a lot more wide open type of a game. And then they get into the NFL and these defenses are playing too high. They've got a lot of good secondary guys. They've got a much better pass rush. And these quarterbacks are seeing something that they weren't accustomed to seeing as they were developing younger on. And Tom Brady even came out, I think it was yesterday or the day before that, on a podcast talking about how he wishes quarterbacks were not thrust out there right away, in the first game. He wishes that there was more time for them to develop, and how much he benefited from that, and how he benefited from, he called it like the program at Michigan. And, it was what he learned there and the program and how it taught him protection schemes and alignments, and as opposed to just calling plays, he was learning about what was expected out of him and being coached on that. And then when he got to the NFL, he had time to develop with some great coaching as well in that first year before he had to do anything. And, now quarterbacks aren't given the benefit of that as they, we'll see what happens. We're really in the infancy stages of the NIL era and, quarterbacks jumping from team to team, but they're certainly not being indoctrinated into like a program. They don't have the time for that. And then they're getting to the NFL and they're being asked to start, within the first few games for the most part. So I'm not necessarily advocating that you let your quarterback sit. There is something to be said for getting that experience because you only have that rookie deal which presents such a market inefficiency from a salary perspective to give a team an advantage. And if you burn that first year by not letting your quarterback get enough development in game action so that you can not only let him deal with some things and improve, but also coach him up in the film room about what he's seeing and what he's doing out there to set a high enough floor for year 2, then you're going to have, you've burned that year and now you don't have as many years at that really cheap salary for him, which we've seen a lot of teams around the league be able to, they get a young quarterback and then they build up that roster really quickly in the second, third year. And all of a sudden they're a competitor. And, we've seen that with Brock Purdy and the San Francisco 49ers. Every single year, there's teams that are capable of doing that. Now, they had a great team prior to that, but his cheap salary definitely did not hurt anything for them. So I don't disagree at all. Some of these young guys are not working out. I think the NFL is very different than what it once was. But more so, the youth levels and college just aren't getting them quite as prepared for what they're experiencing when they get to the NFL. And so it's really on the coaches in the NFL to have a great ability to get a guy very comfortable. You cannot bring a guy in there. It's almost like the argument for Jacoby Brissett and Drake May in New England, right? Like, we know Jacoby Brissett is a journeyman quarterback who does not have the highest upside in New England, and you do not want to start him the full season. But with the state of the health of their tackles on the offensive line for the New England Patriots and the frequency that Drake May is likely to get destroyed behind center because he doesn't have all the protections down and he doesn't know the adjustments and he's not as proficient audibling at the line of scrimmage. And we said earlier, controlling that pressure like a Jacoby Brissett might be. Like, do you want to shell shock him by throwing him in there, even though he might give you the best upside week 1, and risk him getting sacked too much, injured, setting his overall growth back? I would say what we want out of that Jacoby Brissett, Drake May situation is we want Drake May to start his second season at the highest floor possible. And so it's on that coaching staff to figure out when the right time is to get him into the starting lineup. But I definitely do not think it would be week 1, and we'll see. I mean, Gerard Mayer has now said that it's like open competition, could be like 50-50. And I certainly have bet against that. I think Jacoby Brissett will be the week 1 starter, but hopefully I'm not proven wrong. We'll see.
Well, that seems to be more sensible, and people maybe should take a lesson from what's worked out with the Packers, who either by strategy or happenstance have done this apprenticeship model where the guy learns under the main guy for a while before being thrown out there. Jordan Love had been thrown out there a couple years ago, and we know that this last season, it was really bad for the first half of the season, but they and he were able to turn it around. Could it have possibly been turned around if that had occurred 2 seasons prior? Or would they just think this guy is a bust and the whole thing goes horribly and then they're back on the carousel trying to find a new quarterback? So there does seem to be some validity in the idea that you got to bring these guys along slowly and not just throw them to the wolves. Now, I think the leitmotif of this podcast is inefficiencies, hunting for inefficiencies. I know some of you listening are probably going to disagree with some of this. I am cursed with a subscriber base who thinks like I do. So, they're going to be argumentative and they're going to find something to counter. But I wonder, is this a potential inefficiency that is downstream from, fantasy sports? Wide receivers, the wide receiver market, they're making over $30 million a year now, and it doesn't appear as though there's a lot of proof of concept there, that paying a wide receiver big money results in your team getting dramatically better. And yet the money just keeps going up. And Vish Kumaran, who does great stuff on the 49ers, he floated to me that he thinks it's the fantasy football effect, that running backs have gotten less important, wide receivers have gotten more important. And as stupid as it sounds, that might have an impact on what teams do and who we consider to be a star. Just the numbers, the eye-popping numbers. Is that a crazy theory, or would you argue and say, no, wide receivers are that valuable and the market is correctly reflecting that?
No, I tend to agree with you guys. And secondly, on the just big picture concept of fantasy football and that influence into the NFL, like you see it a lot. You see it a lot. And this is one of the things where I think there could be this dissatisfaction with what the fans are seeing in the on-field product if scoring is down, because fantasy football is a massive market. And the NFL wants people to tune into games. They said, years ago, we don't like sports betting. Sports betting is evil. Like, we don't, Roger Goodell's coming out and saying that. Yet people that are betting on games are far more likely to watch the games. And so this is a large part of your viewership. And obviously we now know that, betting is legalized in many states. And so people are able to do it a little bit more frequently. And so viewership is setting, breaking records all the time. Fantasy football brings a lot of viewers to the TV. And if their wide receivers and their quarterbacks aren't scoring anything and the game is becoming very boring because points per game are going down, like, that's not good for fantasy football. That's not good for viewership in general. People are going to be turning off their TV more frequently. So this is why I think that the NFL wants to have scoring increase, but they can easily do it if they tweak some of the way that they're calling these defensive penalties and just incur the wrath as necessary. But as a topic for like 15 minutes ago, let's touch on the wide receivers and the tight ends. With regard to the tight ends, I actually did an analysis prior to last season when I was writing over at Fox Sports. So if you Google NFL doesn't appreciate tight ends, you can find this analysis. It's up at Fox Sports. But at that point in time, so it's like 1 year ago, so these numbers are slightly dated. The average top 5 wide receiver made about 27 million. You said it's about 30 million. So we're close. The average tight end at that time made 14.9 million. So almost half. The top 5 tight end makes almost half what the top 5 wide receiver was bringing to the table. But the efficiency of tight ends, especially with the way that we're talking about how defenses are playing, the tight ends are more efficient than wide receivers. Defenses now are blitzing less. They're playing man coverage less. They're increasing the rate of no blitz zone coverage. And against that type of coverage, tight ends were averaging 55% success rate, whereas wide receivers 41%. Tight ends were bringing in 74% completion rate versus wide receivers at 68% completion rate. Tight ends were just more efficient on those types of targets. And then you look around the NFL at some of these teams. Travis Kelce, I had a tweet out there, led the NFL in receiving yards since 2015, but he's 20th in receiver spending. Like, his earnings were 20th. 19 players that were receivers, whether tight ends or running backs. And obviously there were tight ends or wide receivers. He was the top tight end that was being paid, but I believe it is a huge market inefficiency, even to this day, that tight ends are more efficient targets because of the way the defenses are being played, and they're going for a lot cheaper. And if you look around the NFL, as I was kind of alluding to, look at like Travis Kelce, George Kittle, Mark Andrews. We're talking about 3 of the best teams in the NFL, the Baltimore Ravens, San Francisco 49ers, Kansas City Chiefs. They all understand the value of a good tight end. They all understand, let's pay this tight end. I mean, when has Lamar Jackson actually had a really good wide receiving core? Like, he has never had that. Mark Andrews is his best guy, and Andrews got hurt last season. And then you translate that out to the Philadelphia Eagles to some extent as well. They've had tight ends getting large tight end contracts and has really helped their efficiency. One of my biggest mantras as it relates to the NFL is I love it when teams do something different and do it well, because on a 1 week to prepare, the opposing defense has to then adjust massively to you, and the rules are already in your favor, and you are implementing in that game something that you practice day in and day out, and it's different than what they do what they're used to facing, and they have to all of a sudden make some adjustments to try to deal with it. And part of that relates to, heavier personnel groupings. One of the reasons why Kyle Shanahan is my favorite play caller, play designer in the NFL. Like, I won't say anything negative about Andy Reid. I love Andy Reid. I think he's my favorite overall coach. But in terms of, calling offense, I love Kyle Shanahan, and I love what he brings to the table. But both of these guys experiment with heavier tight end sets or bringing fullbacks onto the field, doing different things, unique things that opposing defenses are not accustomed to dealing with. Whereas you have your very benign offensive coordinators out there who just like trot out like Eric Bieniemy was doing, 3 wide receivers. Every play looks kind of similar. There's no disguise. When you have the tight ends out there, there can be disguise. You can use play action and it works a little bit better. You can throw the ball out of the heavy sets on first down, and we know first down passing is very efficient. So I do believe that wide receivers, we see their salaries going up. And I think that statistically, you see some of these guys, and, it's always talked about you need a great number one wide receiver. And I'm not going to argue like Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk aren't great at what they do, but we have seen the Kansas City Chiefs and the Philadelphia Eagles and the Baltimore Ravens. Now, Philly with AJ Brown has obviously made a difference there. But let's talk about the Ravens and the Chiefs, for example. Great teams have not had to spend a whole lot on wide receivers over the last several years. They have not had very good receiver production. They use heavier personnel groupings, and they're running through the NFL for the most part, during the regular season. So that is the style of offense that I gravitate towards more and I appreciate more, and I think has the higher floor and the more overall efficiency is this creativity with heavier personnel groupings. And I think it does represent a market inefficiency where teams are using a lot of, multiple wide receiver sets and trying to pay and overpay to bring one in the top number one. And we know this, but like spending in free agency is obviously a net negative. I mean, when you overpay, you have a 1 year bump, generally speaking. You will get that 1 year, but then almost all of these guys, they end up hitting the cap for a lot more money their second season because they're normally signing to a couple year deal. And that second season, they're hitting the cap for a lot more. And their production, I'm sure this is far more typical in basketball, but like if you look at football, one guy in one system, the way that he's producing, it's hard for coaches to like translate what's he going to do in our system with our quarterback and how can we use him? And sometimes you're never getting the same level of production that you got before. So the guy has earned his production from what he's done in the past on a different team. You bring him here, you're paying him for what he could do in the future, but he's not able to reach that level in this new environment. And that happens with wide receivers as well in free agency.
Yeah, it's just, there is almost this game theoretical aspect to it where if nobody else is paying the tight end more, then we don't have to. It almost seems like there's a conspiracy in the NFL against the tight end. But it's odd to just look at the top paid wide receivers that go down the list and think to yourself, would you have wanted most of these guys over Travis Kelce the last 5 years? I just think it's not even close. And that just, again, it just seems to be one of these things where it's done this way because it's been done this way. I obviously understand that they're game-breaking wide receivers. I understand why Tyreek Hill gets paid a lot of money, but it doesn't seem like everybody in that top tier should be getting that kind of money relative to what the tight ends get. Hey, maybe we're wrong. Maybe somebody who designs offenses could come in and explain how we're incorrect and the wide receiver is this valuable. But this is something that I consistently think about, which is that there are conventional wisdoms in the NFL about what positions matter and what positions are less important. And I just don't know what that's all based on. I don't know if that's actually grounded in reality or if it's we've been doing it this way because we've been doing it this way. I've brought up safety. Some of the greatest defenses I've seen have had an impact safety who haunts the quarterback. And safety just seems to be one of these positions that in the NFL draft, people don't say you need a safety. You must have a safety. Are there any positions out there that you look at and you go, yeah, that's an undervalued position. The league doesn't undervalue it enough, or is tight end mostly the one that's the big market inefficiency?
Well, there's a few. I also really think that centers are very valuable. They are for the most part helping adjust the protections for the quarterback and helping to prevent that and reduce that pressure. They are one of the few guys that touches the ball on every snap, and I think that's why I'm fascinated to see, the Eagles have a hand-picked center to replace and Cam Jurgens to replace Jason Kelce. But I'm really fascinated to see what happens with the tush push and with other things when Jason Kelce's not out there for the Philadelphia Eagles in 2024. So I think center is the first one that comes to mind, in my opinion.
And that would make a lot of sense. I think what's also interesting about the NFL to me is we sort of treat all the stats as though they're arrived at the same way, but no, the conditions are markedly different. You've done a lot of work on how certain teams have schedules that are brutal, but other teams have schedules that are fairly light. I wrote something last season because it didn't occur to me, and you've probably looked into all of this, that being a quarterback in the AFC puts you under pressure of the elements in a way that being a quarterback in the NFC does not, unless you're the quarterback of the Green Bay Packers and maybe the Bears if they go to the playoffs. But it's just a totally different league. You need to be able to play in harsh conditions if you're going to advance to the Super Bowl if you're an AFC quarterback. But in the NFC, I mean, I even wrote it down where I call it the tundra tier, stadium situations where the average in January is sub 25 degrees. And there are 7 in the AFC, but only 2 in the NFC. And now I'm rambling. I'm just saying that it's such a quirky league that way, where we will regard the output as all kind of being arrived at in the same way, but the situations are odd. Are a lot of the time very different, and some have it easier and some have it much harder.
100% agree. The AFC North is the most brutal division to play quarterback in, because you've got, not only do you have the weather elements to your point with, Pittsburgh and Cleveland and Cincinnati being up in that area of the country in the wintertime, but you also have these ridiculously good defenses year in and year out in that division. You've got good, solid defensive-minded coaches. John Harbaugh was a special teams guy, but he's got a great feel for defense and bringing in defensive coaches, rotating them through that always kind of elevate that. That's an emphasis of theirs. And then, of course, Mike Tomlin is a defensive-oriented head coach himself. So, and you're right. Then you just look at, compare Lamar Jackson's stats to every other quarterback. It's why people last year would be like, well, Lamar Jackson's stats, these aren't good enough for an MVP, right? Look at these stats. They're not good enough. And they're comparing them to, like you said, your Jared Goff, who plays a lot of games in domes in the NFC, versus what Lamar's doing against all these ridiculously good defenses in the AFC in the weather without any real wide receiving threats, to be mentioned. So, I'm not trying to necessarily advocate for Lamar MVP, although I didn't feel like that was necessarily undeserved. But just to point out, I completely agree with your thought process there. And when we zoom out and we look at, what were the stats last year? It's natural just to group everybody together and not look at the context nearly as much. And so that's why one of the things I found an edge in doing and started doing it years ago is when I had got my hands on the play-by-play data, and you could separate out fourth quarters, you could separate out third downs, and you could look at what downs are more likely to have offensive intent in them. And that's because I view third down as a reactionary down. It's entirely based on distance to go. And the biggest driver to whether you're going to convert that third down or not is just that distance to go. It's highly correlated. So back out third downs. What plays you're calling in the fourth quarter are completely predicated upon what the game theory is, what the situation in the game. So back out the fourth quarter. So I would do a lot of my analysis on early downs in either the first half or early downs in the first 3 quarters of games. And I know there are some people out there, sometimes I'm parsing it down smaller and smaller, and they're saying, well, you run into sample size issues, right? Because the NFL, there's just not as many plays. But the way that I look at it is, I'm helping a coach game plan for week 1 or week 2. What do you want me to look at? There hasn't been a game played yet, but I'm supposed to help try to figure out and take me out of the equation. Also, the coach is trying to figure out what to do against this team. He's got to be able to operate with a limited amount of data, and he's got to make decisions, and then he's got to make adjustments quickly on the fly as a little bit more data comes in. And it's not like baseball where you have as many games. There's very few plays and there's very few games. So unless you can get comfortable with being uncomfortable as it relates to the smaller sample size that the NFL has than other sports, then you're probably not going to be able to draw very many good conclusions or present good arguments or thoughts for what could be done in certain games to attack an opponent. And that's why there's got to be like the best coaches are the ones that can make those in-game adjustments. You try something, okay, that's not working. Was it working because the data that we were relying on to come up with these ideas is too small of a sample size, or was it something on our end? Did we have an injury, to our right guard and right tackle, and so we couldn't protect on that side, and it prevented us from doing this? Was the weather bad in this game? Like, whatever the situation might be, it could be the data, could be other factors. You then have to make some adjustments as quickly as possible to then try to do something a little bit differently. So we got way off track on that one.
It's okay. It reminded me of how the Lions are an interesting case in this respect, because they've become the symbolic go for it on fourth down team, but the numbers for Jared Goff are not good when it comes to his passing on fourth down. And that's just going to be a small sample size. It has to be. But you can also have a theory as to why that's the case. He's not Mr. Improvisation, and a fourth down is different from another down, because if it's not there, you still have to make something happen. You can't just throw it out of bounds. And so it makes sense that Goff is not, or has not been, good on fourth down. And so that's a situation that's intriguing for me with the Lions. And the Lions are just a really good team, and I think could be a Super Bowl team, but they've got this funny conundrum of being on the forefront of what the analytics say you should do, with possibly the quarterback who is, among good quarterbacks, the least able to do it.
Agree. Jared Goff and the Lions are a fascinating team this year. I also agree that I think this is a team that it's not a hot take anymore to suggest that this team could get back to the NFC Championship game, but I honestly think that they could. I think that there's a few things that must happen naturally for them to do that differently than what happened last year for them. I think it's got to happen on the defensive side of the ball. They're so lucky to keep their head coach, offensive play caller, and Ben Johnson around. It's just like the Chiefs. Like, I have no idea how Steve Spagnuolo stays in Kansas City calling those plays. Like, we know Andy Reid's going to be on the offensive side of the ball, just like Kyle Shanahan is going to be on the offensive side for the 49ers. But look at all the guys that Kyle's had to work through on the defensive side that go get jobs. And then, when you talk about Salah, you're talking about in Houston, names slipping my mind right now. But then you've got, Steve Spagnuolo, who just stays in Kansas City. Yeah. He's, in my opinion, the best single game defensive coordinator in the NFL.
49ers fan Anthony May says DeMeco Ryans. Yeah, well, I think part of that's the youth of those defensive guys, especially the 49ers guys. They had so much vigor on the sidelines, and Spagnuolo, I think it's older coaches seem to be less favored, which maybe it should be that way in American business. It seems like so many massive corporations are sclerotic, and you'll have somebody over the age of 70 or even 80 running them. But since we take football more seriously than we take some of the most important industries and governmental entities, we actually say, no, you've got to have the proper energy, and you've got to have the proper ability to adjust and be flexible, as young people have. Spag seems like the unusual older coach who can do that. But yeah, for whatever reason, he just has not gotten the sort of opportunity that woos him away. And he's just a very impressive figure to me. Just the way he talks about the game, the way he sees the game. Any interview you hear with him is fascinating, and it doesn't seem to be any kind of coincidence or accident that he and the Chiefs have been as successful as they are. But maybe it also speaks to Warren defense just tends to get short shrift. I mean, do you see that? I see that in basketball, certainly. It's half the game. It doesn't get treated like it's half the game. It gets treated like it's 10% of the game.
Right. And well, I think the rules, and the way the league has operated has made it more difficult for defense. But naturally, I think good offense is always going to beat good defense. I just do, because defense is always reacting. But what I like in the NFL is the defense has started to fight back. We know that based on the coverages, they're fighting back, but also some of their delayed blitzes and the way that they're making late moves. Just like offense uses pre-snap motion or play action to try to get the defense to get out of position, defenses are using a lot more of these sim pressures, which the quarterback thinks he's got a picture, blinks, snaps the ball, looks up, picture's totally changed because a sim pressure was coming and somebody's dropped out. Now they're getting pressure over here. He made the adjustments. It's not what he thought it was going to be. And I know like the Baltimore Ravens and Mike McDonald had a lot of success with that last season. So, these coaches on the defensive side of the ball, they are fighting back and they're getting, they're very talented. A lot of these guys are quite talented. Spags, he did have, I think it was the head coach of the LA Rams, if I'm not mistaken, a while ago. And then of course, like he settled back into this role. Maybe he just wants to be in this role, but we also saw a guy like that in Dan Quinn, who was head coach. He made a stint at head coach, did not work out with the Atlanta Falcons, went back to becoming defensive coordinator. Now he's got another opportunity in Washington, D.C. So it has happened, but I don't disagree. Offense is sexy. The quarterbacks are the marquee players. The wide receivers are the divas. They're going to make all the headlines, and that's what brings fans into the game. That's why all the fantasy players, it's all about the offensive side of the football pretty much. And, it's worshipped on that side of the football. Defense, rightfully should have, kind of a mindset of feeling like they are getting the short end of the stick.
Yeah, and it really does. Obviously, Mahomes is incredible, but I don't think enough can be said of the Chiefs and how they run that operation, how they somehow get their defensive backs up to speed rather quickly, cycle them out, find new guys to replace them, and do really well, and are innovative strategically. They do a lot of really intriguing, smart things over there, like going cover zero against Lamar Jackson, but with 2 QB spies, stuff like that, where maybe because he's so comfortable and has so much cachet, Spags feels as though he's just more able to try different things than what other people might do. But I mean, we could talk about all of this for a long while, but we should probably start wrapping. Let's give you a topic that isn't about the strategy, but it's more that you're somebody who will speak truth to the power that is the NFL and criticize some things. What do you make of how much Sunday NFL ticket now costs? What's your take on that?
Well, I think it's corporate greed in terms of what the NFL is attempting to do here. For Roger Goodell, he views himself the way that.
Well, one second. I don't want to interrupt, but like, how much is it? Because I didn't have that called up to memory. I just remember getting sticker shock. It was $679.
I believe it was $679 per year, and then if you get the Red Zone add-on, it's $700 some. But that is on the App Store if you buy it through the App Store. But now we have to get, if you want to watch all the games, you have to get Peacock, you have to get Netflix, you have to get Prime Video, you have to get ESPN Plus. You have to get, I think, NFL Plus maybe, and then Sunday Ticket. And potentially you want the Red Zone package added onto it. I personally have YouTube TV because that gives me the direct ticket on that. And so, well, I guess it's not called the direct ticket because I was with DirecTV. It's called Sunday Ticket now. So I don't know exactly how much that bundle is, but the whole thing obviously is pretty insane. Now, that being said, I don't know what it is for other sports, but I know that Roger Goodell, when he brings in more revenue for the team, for the teams themselves, then those guys want to keep him on board, and it helps his job security and it helps his bonuses. And so he's doing what is in his own best interest by negotiating these deals where he's going to get big money. But I just hate the fact that all of us as consumers can't just, I don't want to sound like an old man here, so I won't belabor this point, but we used to be able to just turn on the TV and there's the games and, you're getting it with your antenna and that's that. Obviously then cable came in, so you pay for that. But the fact of the matter is, one game on Netflix, one game on this streaming platform versus the other streaming platform. If you want to watch it, you can. And of course, the NFL isn't dumb. So they're putting, Travis Kelce on those games so that all the Swifties are going to sign up for that because they want to watch every single Taylor Swift in the box. If she's in the box, they want to watch that game. So of course, they're going to put Travis Kelce's Chiefs games on these types of standalone on a new platform that somebody's going to have to subscribe to. And it's a little frustrating. And it's not that I can't afford it or other people can't afford it, but is it right to do this with the sport and put these games when you're buying the Sunday ticket, then you have to buy all these other things as well just to be able to watch these teams play their games. So I don't like it. I don't like it at all. But this is the future. Like, it's not going backwards. We're not taking it back and putting it back inside the box now. Once they did, and I announced it the very first time I saw that they put Kansas City on that game last year on the Prime. I forget what the platform was. Was it Netflix or Peacock? As soon as they did, I was like, they're so smart getting all the Swifties to buy it. And then, of course, they set records. And I guarantee if it wasn't Travis Kelce with all those Swifties who came on board last year, if it was a different game, if it was like the Packers versus the Bears, okay, we would have not seen the record-breaking numbers, setting all the streaming records. And now, but because we did, future companies want to come in and pay a lot for these opportunities. And that's just going to drive the price up moving forward, because there's it's just pure economics. There's a limited supply of these things.
Yeah, I call it the peacockification after that game, that you're just going to see more of these events behind the paywall and the customer will get cockified. It reminds me a little bit of Peter Thiel's We Wanted Flying Cars, but instead we got 140 characters. We wanted flying cars, but instead we just got paywalled playoff games that would have been on network TV. Right. And now we've got to pay for it. Hey, everybody's got to run their business as to how they see fit. I guess I will have one final football question for you, or maybe two, on the way out before we wrap this up. It's, who do you think is the most underrated NFL player, and who do you think is the most overrated NFL player? And we can give you a little pause. I didn't prep you on that one. You quite diligently asked me what I'd be asking. I didn't say this, so I'm springing it on you, but I'm wondering if you have a response to those two.
Yeah, that's tricky, because I would probably have to say, to me, George Kittle is the most underrated NFL player. I think from what he gets paid and what he contributes to that offense, I think a player like that who can do so many different things, oftentimes unheralded, oftentimes doesn't show up on the stat sheet. You look at him and his receiving yards have dipped a little bit, but what he brings to the table when he's on the field, I think it's hard to argue that he's not somebody that's extremely underappreciated, underrated. In terms of overrated, man, I would probably have to go with one of the top wide receivers. You know, I can't pick one out by name, but you know, these guys, they bring a lot of attention on themselves, and some of them, you know, like when we're talking about Tyreek Hill, right? I believe Tyreek is worth the money. It's hard though when you pay him the money to build the rest of your team. But is he worth that money? I do think so, because what he brings when he steps foot out on the field and how defenses then have to start playing it impacts the entire rest of your offense. But there are other receivers. I don't have the top, 10 paid receivers pulled up in front of me, but somewhere on that list is a guy who doesn't dictate defense nearly as much as like a Tyreek Hill would, but who is still getting a ton of money because those players are getting, are just the salaries are exploding for them. So it probably is somebody outside the number one wide receiver paid position, but inside the top 10. Maybe you could take your pick, but somebody in that range.
Yeah, I'm reminded of that weird conversation about Brock Purdy that Cam Newton was having. Is he a game manager or a game changer? Which I think is a dumb conversation to have about quarterbacks, because they just matter so much. Every decision they make can change the game. But I do think that there's a similar conversation that could be had about wide receivers, where some wide receivers are scheme changers and some are just good. And that's a real distinction, and should be a distinction in terms of who you pay. There are guys who run great routes, but it's just not the same as the defensive coordinator waking up in a night sweat, worried about Tyreek Hill and having to give up a strategic concession that you can take advantage of just to deal with that. So I guess that's the final point that we will end on. And Warren, you're always doing a million different things. We reserve the outro for somebody to plug what they're currently up to. What are you currently up to? What should people check out?
Well, I've got let me pull it open here, my 2024 football preview book. And you can buy the printed copy on Amazon. It's 559 pages. I love the printed copy, but for your listeners, if you go to sharp.football, which is the link to the website, you can get this for only $5. It's regularly $35, but I mean, that's a massive discount just to get people to check it out. Now, it's the PDF only version, but you can get it for only $5. Just enter the coupon code HOS for House of Strauss. HOS. There you go. We made that for you. So it's got a chapter on every single team out there, and it'll help teach you about whether you have a favorite team or you're like me, you just root for teams to be efficient. You can read through all of them, but it's good from a reference tool as well in season, especially if you like betting on these games, because it'll tell you the rest advantages and disadvantages, which we didn't have a lot of time to talk about here, but are massively impactful in terms of overall performance. And I list them out game by game for every single team, plus what the betting lines are as of now in the summer. And then you can see how much they change at week 12, at week 13. And is it warranted for the line to have changed this much? So I think you'll really enjoy it. And for $5, you can't go wrong.
Well, we appreciate that. Appreciate the level of preparation and dedication. This has been fantastic. Thanks so much, Warren.
Thanks for having me.